This presentation is to give you a little bit of information about Calvert County and particularly the area of Parker's Creek, but also a plug for doing family history because I learned about Parker's Creek as a result of having looked at my own family history to try to determine who on each of my family lines was the first ancestor to immigrate to North America. So that was actually a fun way to dive into family history. If you haven't done it, you might look at your own lines to do the same. So what surprised me is I learned I have very deep roots in Maryland and Virginia. I had previously thought that most of my immigrant families came to this country through Massachusetts early on, and many did, but also many families arrived in Maryland and Virginia early on, even before the Mayflower arrived in Massachusetts. So let's look at a little bit of the history of this area and my connection to it, and then learn about the area that we'll be visiting when we do our Parker's Creek event this Saturday. So John Smith created this beautiful map of Virginia in 1612, more than 400 years ago. At that time, of course, most of the location names were for Native American tribes in the area. My first ancestors arrived here in Virginia in 1611, so very early on. Lady Elizabeth Fuller Clements and her 4 children. At the time, she was a widow. Her husband, Lord Geoffrey Clements, who was the Lord Mayor of London and helped charter the Virginia-London Company in 1607, died of a sudden illness, so he was unable to sail to the colony. But his son, Jeremiah, from whom I am descended, was just 4 years old when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean with his mother, Lady Elizabeth Fuller Clements, and his siblings. They came on the ship named George and arrived in 1611 at Jamestown. Before white settlement of Maryland, the area belonged to the Powhatan, Piscataway, and other tribes. When John Smith is reported to be the first Westerner to lay eyes on Calvert County's peninsula and described it in his journal in 1608 in his exploration of the bay. The first English settlement in Maryland dates from 1634 when the Dove and the Ark arrived to the area now known as St. Mary's. Cecil County, or Cecil, depending on your view of things, was established and named after my ancestor, Cecilius Calvert, 2nd Lord Baltimore. So this was fun for me to find out that I am related to this prominent person who was the first proprietor of Maryland, and also through him I'm related to, of course, the 1st Lord Baltimore. So I have very deep roots here in Maryland, and that's fun for me to know because I always thought of myself as a transplanted Utahn, whereas in reality our family's just been in Utah a relatively short period of time, and there are many, many generations, over 400 years nearly, who've lived here in the Maryland, Virginia area. So I find that very interesting. Anyway, Maryland was settled primarily by Puritans, Huguenots, Quakers, and Scots. The Huguenots were people from France who had to leave France because of religious persecution, and there are several Huguenots in my line who came very early on to Cecil County. That county was later partitioned into St. Mary's, Charles, and Prince George's County. So it covered quite a large area initially. It's also interesting to note that many of the Virginians were unhappy, and prominent Virginian leaders fought against the granting and continuance of the Maryland colony to their north. They felt it was something of an infringement on their rights to that property when Lord Baltimore was granted his charter. So Cecil Calvert, 2nd Baron Baltimore, and the person we tend to think of as Lord Baltimore, was the first proprietor of Maryland, but he was also a proprietor governor of Newfoundland and Avalon. And he established and managed Maryland from his home in England, and that was important because actually a lot of what had to be done was politically protecting the charter that had been granted, which required his being there to defend that charter in England. He was a Roman Catholic, and because of that, Maryland was a place where religious tolerance was promoted. And when the ships, the Ark and the Dove, arrived in 1634 to St. Mary's, they brought about 320 colonists. And it's interesting that they were about evenly divided between Protestants and Catholics. But Maryland over time became a haven for Catholics. And this was a time of fierce persecution for Catholics in England. So this was a safe haven for people to come to practice their religion. And Lord Baltimore, my ancestor, governed Maryland for 42 years. So this is a map of the area from 1685. And in tracing my family lines, I've learned that there are about 10 of my families that came and settled in Maryland, 14 settled in Virginia, of which 5 went on to settle in Maryland, 3 families settled in Pennsylvania, and these were immigrants between the dates of 1611 and 1753. And so, and of course, each of these first immigrant families had descendants, so there were many, many families over time settling in this Maryland, Virginia area to which I'm related. So I find that very interesting, and maybe I'll find work that I can do on our family lines, because there are a number of dead ends where the line doesn't trace back much beyond the family that was the first immigrant here. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Parker's Creek. So Parker's Creek is named for one of my ancestors, William Parker, who was born about 1604, died in 1684, and so his life coincided almost exactly with that of Cecil, second Lord Baltimore. William Parker was granted 600 acres in 1651, just north of the Calvert Cliffs State Park, and he owned the area that we'll be visiting on our canoe trip at Parker's Creek Preserve. It's quite exciting. So Jeff and I did a trip to kind of explore the areas of Maryland where I had early ancestors. And that's when we first encountered this lovely park. It's interesting that this area has been preserved by the good work of just private individuals who in the 1980s saw that it was slated for commercial private development. They purchased about 500 acres of land to stop that development from occurring, and then over time have added to that. They've named their nonprofit the American Chestnut Land Trust because there was a very large American chestnut on the property. And over time, as more land's been added, there now is around 3,500 acres. There are around 3,500 acres of land being preserved by the ACLT, and that's where we will be canoeing in this what's considered most pristine stream of Maryland, and it will cross through woodland, marsh, and eventually open at its mouth at the bay. Near the Calvert Cliffs. So just a bit of information about William Parker. He was born in Stepney, England, 1607 approximately. He was a prosperous London merchant who owned several ships, and he was a very early settler in Maryland. And I'm assuming he probably first came on one of his own trading ships, though I don't find any documentation to that. He continued to have strong ties in London with family, merchant, and legal communities, and made multiple trips back and forth from Maryland, again, in his company-owned ships. He married Elizabeth Woodcock in 1626 at St. Dunstan's, London, And she died 10 years later after their third daughter, Mary, was born. I am related to her first child and first daughter, Thomasine. And it's interesting to me, Thomasine married into the Kent family, and the Kent family owned the property at a large holding just north of the Parkers Creek area. So she settled into this area, having married into that family. So back to William Parker, there are records in the Historic Library in Annapolis about his arriving in Maryland in 1635. So that's just 1 year after the founding of St. Mary's. He's also likely to have helped found Anne Arundel County in 1649. And he was granted 200 acres of land in Anne Arundel in 1651. And even that's interesting. It turns out Anne Arundel County is named after one of my ancestors, Anne Arundel, who married the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil. So I don't know, it's just kind of fun to find out I'm very deeply rooted to Maryland. Oh, and I forgot to mention on the slide about Cecil that it is his family crest that is the beautiful design we have on our Maryland state flag. Okay, so at the American Chestnut Land Trust, in addition to just the beautiful natural areas, there's also a lovely demonstration garden with flowers, herbs, fruit, and vegetables. That is in a different part of the park than where we will be launching for our canoe trip. There are also many miles of hiking trails through the woods, and definitely worth, even if you're not coming on our canoe trip, this is a fun part of the state to explore, so you might like to come some other time. And that's one reason I'm putting together this little slideshow, so if you do come back and want to explore more beyond Parkers Creek, you'll know some of the things there. So this is just Jeff and some of the trail areas as part of the Parkers Creek Preserve. So this preserve is just north of the Calvert Cliffs State Park. That's a great state park to visit. It's a place where you can find ancient sharks' teeth and other fossils that were laid down 10 to 20 million years ago in what was then an ancient ocean, and then preserved in these layers of clay and silt. The state park features a beach, the fossils, playground, fishing, freshwater and tidal marsh, and 13 miles of hiking trails. It's just a day use only park, though there is a campground that's not associated with the park but nearby. So some additional things that we saw when we were doing our little family history trip that I thought I mentioned that you might like to visit. So I'm related to the Thomas Claggett, and his property, part of his property has descended down to his descendants, and in 1981 the original homestead and about 300 acres surrounding it was donated to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to be preserved as a farm to provide food for people who can't afford fresh food, and also to preserve woodland and meadows and stream area. And what's quite lovely about this is it's in now what is a pretty highly urbanized part of the state, just outside of the Andrews Air Force Base. And when you visit there, it's like stepping back in time. The original home was built in 1670. And when you look, especially from the back side of the home, you can see it's kind of in three sections. And the smallest section was, I would presume, the first section that was built, and then the second and third segment of the home. So now it's quite a large and gracious home, but originally would have started as a smaller homestead. And so there you can see the three parts of the home. It was fun to visit and see someone still lives there. But what's especially interesting, and it's open to the public, is you can come and see there's an original tobacco barn from that 1600s, and that's very rare that it should still be in existence. And there are barrels, tobacco barrels, and you can see the way the tobacco is hung to dry. You can see the hand-hewn beams that made up the barn. It's very interesting. Also, there are a lot of older, when you're visiting these communities, it's kind of fun to stop and visit some of the old churches. So, for example, I'm related to Thomas Hillary, and he donated the land in 1692 where this first All Saints Church was built. And he happened to be the first High Sheriff of Prince George's County in 1696, after it was separated out from Calvert County. And of course, it's fun to wander the old cemeteries and look at the gravestones. Now, this is not the original church, but one that was built in the 1700s, as the original was just a log building. Although I didn't find the family line of Hillary, there were Kent names here, which were descendants in another of the lines through which I'm related. So it was kind of fun to see. And from the church records to learn that Absalom Kent, an ancestor of mine, purchased a pew number 6 in the All Saints Church in 1703. And there are Kent gravestones there. And of course, it's fun to see they're very beautiful. This is an old oak. You know, oaks have are very long-lived trees, so it's entirely possible that this tree could be 400 years old, might have been planted early in the association with this church. Chesapeake Beach, a number of my ancestors owned property there, and it's a fun little town to visit. We ate lunch there in a really good seafood place. Anyway, one of my relatives, Benoit, he was from France and had to emigrate. He was a Huguenot, had to leave because of his religious beliefs, found safety in this new land of Maryland, and was granted 1,150 acres. So he early on was the landowner from Chesapeake Beach, this area on south. I'm also related to the Veches, or Vetch, I'm not sure how you pronounce the name, and this Christ Church, established in 1672, is one that my ancestor donated land for, where the church was built, and it says here, Calvert County's oldest continuously worshiping congregation. So again, a very interesting, very old communities. And again, these are not the very first churches, because those were originally log and have been since replaced. And I was able to visit with the pastor at this church, who has a typed listing of all of the names and information off of the graves at this church cemetery. But he said those very earliest graves, in those very earliest years, they didn't tend to have carved gravestones. They didn't have those resources yet. And so there are not, from the very earliest ancestors, any gravestones remaining. But it's kind of fun because there are place names. For example, Vetch's Cove was named after my ancestor, James Vetch. And he was from Scotland, born in 1628, and came to this area, was granted land by my relative, Lord Baltimore, in 1649, and he became the Sheriff of Calvert County, 1653 to 57. Often, these early settlers were given very large land grants, sometimes even more than 1,000 acres. And in these early years, they did not typically have slaves, but their labor came from people who didn't have the financial resources to pay for their passage to the New World, and they would come as indentured servants and have to work off for a period of time. And for each person that one of the landowners brought over, they received additional land, typically in grants of 50 acres. And then we stayed overnight at Solomon's Island. This is just the evening view. Fun place if when you're there visiting Calvert County you want to explore. It's also a nice little lighthouse not too far away. So again, just a fun trip within a day's drive of urban area of DC. And makes for a fun day trip or even an overnight exploring the area. If you have the time and you stay overnight, you might like to visit this Battle Creek Cypress Swamp Sanctuary and Nature Center. And some of my ancestors owned this land also, and it's fun to see that it's been preserved. So in walking the trails here, imagining that it looks much as it might have 400 years ago. And these cypress stands were really important. You'll see on land records, often it'll say things like so many acres of meadows, so many acres, planted in so many acres of woods, and then occasionally so many acres of swamp. And that's actually turns out to be a really good resource because these cypress trees are very water resistant, so they're useful for building ships and structures that can last a long time even when exposed to water. Another area worth visiting is this Biscoe Gray Heritage Farm. Originally this area was known as Battletown. It was a very early settlement, and there are archaeologists working in the area to seek artifacts of the Native Americans, early colonists, and African American slaves. There's a tobacco barn there, trails through the woods, and the upper right trail here, it's kind of interesting. You can see the curve of the trail, and it's curved like that because tobacco barrels were rolled there, rolled to the stream where then they were floated to harbor where they could be picked up by the larger ships and taken to England. There's also a device there. It shows where how the tobacco leaves were packed into the barrels. If you happen to have ancestors who settled in this area, I'd highly recommend visiting the Calvert Historic Society. They're extremely helpful. It's a volunteer-run organization, and they have a lot of documents. They're very helpful, and they're organized by family names, and they have files. And when I was there, they had files for all but 2 of the families that I asked for information on. Another interesting spot to stop, even if you're not related to any of these people but just want to know a little bit more of Maryland history, is Port Tobacco. I saw in the newspaper, the Post, did a story after the census, and it was mentioned that this Port Tobacco is the smallest town of which there's a census record in the last census. I think there's now like 6 residents. But at its heyday in the 1700s, it was a very busy shipping port, shipping about 1 million pounds of tobacco a year to England. And it was also a big trading center where the Indians would come and trade with the colonists. It is also of interest historically at the Civil War time because John Wilkes Booth passed through here as he was trying to hide following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And this is an original building from the 1700s, and it's now a museum. It was closed when we visited, so we didn't get to see it on the inside, but it was still very interesting to see. And in my family's, one of my ancestors, Mary Rosamond McAtee, was born in this area in 1682. She had Irish parents who had 12 children. and they lived in this Port Tobacco. And at the time I was doing this research, a little bit earlier this year, her parents' names were unknown, but I think I might have found them in looking through various county records. So kind of exciting, hoping to be able to do some temple work for this family once our temple is open again. And then finally, on the way back home, we stopped at St. John's Broad Creek Episcopal Church, and George Washington worshiped here. It's just across the Potomac River from Mount Vernon, so when weather was bad and the roads not easily passable up to Alexandria, it would be easier for him to cross over by boat on the Potomac to this church, and so he had his own pew here. My ancestor, William Masters, purchased pew number 12 here, and his son was a church warden here for many years. And eventually, I guess, I don't know if the family was moving or what, but they sold the family pew in 1770. And those of you who know me might find this a little bit interesting. I do a lot of talks as a master gardener to community groups about sustainable gardening practices. And I was invited a number of years ago to come speak at this historic church about reducing lawn and putting in native plants in our gardens.